Hello and welcome back to Perspectives, bringing you our daily dose of news and views we hope are relevant to you. In today's show, an Indian man in the US is indicted for trying to export banned material to Russia. This is more evidence of India's support for Putin's Ukraine war. As the jaggi issue is once again raised in the British Parliament, the British government and indeed West Midlands Police once again find themselves in the spotlight. Are they failing the British Sikh community? India basks in its annual blanket of smog and then condemns the West for not paying up to clear it up. And we take another look at the increasing use of alcohol in Punjabi cinema. All this and more in today's packed show. And joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our viewers out there. Thanks for joining us yet once again.
Indeed, and James and I together will be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And of course, as usual, we'll be taking a look at loads of your great comments which have been filling up below our videos. So thank you as always for those. Right, James, let's get the show on the road. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
Of course, we've heard a lot in the recent few years, about the increased level of alcohol being consumed in Punjabi and Sikh movies. And this is not a phenomenon that is just strictly hitting that movie industry. Now, what is driving it is just the simple dollars and cents of it. Now, this is called embedded marketing or embedded advertising, and essentially the manufacturers and distributors of the alcohol brands are paying a huge amount into the film production budgets and television production budgets in order to have their brands there in front of you, or just simply on less of a front stage. Having signage, for example, when people walk into a restaurant and they show the bar with signage with brand names on it. Now, this has become a massive area of spending. Now, in 2024, the media owner's global advertising revenue will amount to an estimated $989.8 billion US dollars. Now, this is up annually at a growth rate of about 7.8% and projected to hit over $1 trillion in 2025. Where does that land the film and television production industry worldwide? Well, you're looking at approximately a $25 billion spend to get these items on the screens in front of you. Now, with the decrease in investment and other areas of the arts, it's very tough for producers to come up with the budgets outside of using these marketing techniques. Now, this could be a cereal brand on a kitchen table as everybody gets into the room for breakfast. It could be the McDonald's ads that you see that incorporate toys and limited edition glasses for animated programs and family shows. But altogether, as I said, it is bringing in $25 billion plus into the film and television production budgets that they otherwise would have to bring in through other ways, which would mean an increase in streaming service costs. And they've already cut back hugely on those budgets already in terms of production values. And this is not, as I said, not just a Punjabi or a Sikh issue when it comes to entertainment. It is a worldwide issue. And as we see in the Western areas where they've actually decriminalized marijuana, there is a substantial increase in the use of marijuana in programs as well, which of course introduces and encourages drug use. And a lot of times it's the younger audience that are more impressionable. And when people deny this, it's obvious, because if the impact was not there, advertisers would not be spending these billions of dollars a year to get these visualizations in your mind, whether in the conscious or subconscious. It contributes to your spending habits. Unfortunately, it also encourages an increase of use when it comes to these more addictive products. And we can talk about addiction levels and addiction to everything from alcohol and drugs right through to sugars and other foods that make us feel good. And that's what it's all about. When you're watching a motion picture or a television show, a lot of times that is taking you from your everyday stresses and the pressures that you're under. And for that 30 to 90 minutes and sometimes longer, that allows you to escape from that environment. You are now entering into a fantasy environment where you are not thinking about those stressors. Now, when you are watching the programs, of course, subliminally, they are bringing in ideas that in order to have fun, in order to celebrate, in order to bury your pain, in order to make it through depression, all of these things, you see people consuming alcohol to get through these things. And that is a big part of the problem, is that they are really trying to normalize the use in order to drive the profits of the multinational conglomerates that are feeding the alcohol to our nations. And this, of course, has come on the coattails of our youth and the increased rise of crime and poverty as people become addicted to these products. Now, there are a lot of different organizations out there that try to curb the amount of alcohol and the amount of advertising seen on screens. And one of them is actually specific to the Punjabi and Sikh cinema increase in alcohol consumption. And on the screen, you can see an address that you can go to, a change.org petition to sign it, to try and have the amount of alcohol and use of it reduced in Punjabi, Sikh, and other movies. And this is also an issue with Muslim-based movies and Christian-based. A lot of different movies are really pushing to reduce things like cigarette use, and yet they are increasing the allowance of marijuana and alcohol use within the entertainment industry. So again, this has become a big problem, Angus, and we're seeing it increase more and more because of brands such as cigarettes and others that cannot advertise legally anymore by this method. We're seeing the film and television production companies pick up the slack by going after the alcohol market, which is a massive advertising pool of money to access, Angus.
Yes, this is quite difficult for the film industry because, of course, the budgets for these films are massive, particularly if you want to at least compete in the mainstream. And of course, they've got to raise this money from somewhere, and investors obviously provide a large part of the budget. But of course, there's usually a shortfall, and quite often, as you pointed out, it is made up from embedded advertising. So it actually forms an essential part of the film industry to ensure that these big budget films can be created in the first place. The problem then that comes, of course, is the moral issues of exactly what it is that you're advertising. Now, I think the interesting link here is to cigarettes, and I think cigarettes stand as quite a prime example here of what actually can be achieved, certainly from a moral standpoint and a health standpoint. Now, alcohol has formed an essential part of Western cinema. Alcohol is perfectly freely available. It is legal across the Western world. And it forms a huge part of Western cinema. I mean, you almost can't watch a film without seeing alcohol somewhere embedded, whether it's a bottle of Heineken or it's a bottle of vodka. They just feature massively, and it's just become almost taken for granted that alcohol forms part of the Western media. However, of course, in the Punjabi world, the Punjabi film world, it is now a relatively new phenomenon. And of course, it is gaining resistance, but it's also gaining traction. And I think there's a bit of a small battlefield sort of forming here, where I think those from the Sikh community are standing up, as we've actually seen, saying, look, hang on a second, is this really something that we want to infiltrate our film industry? And they are rightfully standing up against it, because of course it stands against the very philosophy of Sikhi. And I think the cigarettes and drugs argument actually is a great example of how a barrier can actually be formed against this. Now, I think it is perfectly reasonable and it's expected that many objects, whether it's an Apple computer to a mobile phone to a McDonald's, whatever, I mean, that in itself is questionable in terms of health grounds. But it is perfectly okay, I think, for objects like that to find a home and therefore help the budgets of these films. But when you start looking at material like cigarettes, alcohol, or tobacco, and of course drugs, then I think you are into a very different territory where these materials are clearly a threat to life. They are a threat to health. And I think there is a very reasonable standpoint to say, no, I think these things should not enter the film industry, and I think the same argument could absolutely put up for alcohol. For whatever cultural differences, alcohol is allowed in the West, but in Sikh and indeed Islamic regions, it is not allowed for very good reason. It stands very contrary to everything that they believe in. And therefore, you then enter the frame of, okay, first of all, there is the behavioural side to this, and there's a regulatory side to it. First of all, is it strong enough from a behavioural standpoint that the community itself stands up and say, no, we're not interested in consuming alcohol, we're not interested in consuming cigarettes. This is a huge behavioural change that happened in the West, where cigarettes have actually, and tobacco, have really almost left the Western culture. I mean, it is still there to some degree, in a very small degree, but it has almost been driven out from a purely behavioural choice perspective here in the West. But that in turn was then backed up by regulatory measures, where it actually became against the law. The law made it very difficult to advertise cigarettes in any forum, in any media. And one wonders then if this should in fact be the same in Punjabi cinema. Should the law step in and say, right, we don't want alcohol in our cinema because it does stand against Sikh principles and indeed Islamic principles. So, but then, of course, there is this question of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and we're always standing up for freedom, basic human rights of freedom of expression. If I want to drink, I shall drink, even though it might stand against Sikh. Again, it then comes down to simple moral principles, and again, it's a freedom of choice, but that doesn't make it right. So it's a bit of a grey area, and I'm always loath for regulation to step in on these things, because ultimately we should, as human beings, be free to choose what we do. If our religion dictates that, then we choose to follow the diktats of religion. But again, it should always come down to freedom of choice. But regulation should come in when it starts actually affecting one's health, and it is being pushed by maybe a very powerful industry, and the food industry is a prime example of this. The food lobby, the tobacco lobby are massively resourced because they have a huge financial backing, and it's when they have so much power and their lobbying power becomes so much that they can almost force their material, their goods, upon an unwavering public or an unaware public of how bad these things are. That's when regulation is a good thing, steps in and actually stops these hugely powerful forces from basically harming the public, an unaware and vulnerable public. Alcohol, likewise, again, I'm loath to regulate it against it. I think it should come from a cultural push and a behavioural push from the community itself. I think this is where the community's power can step in, and it's up to the community to say, look, no, we don't want this in our film industry. We will boycott the films if you start pushing it, and that in turn will then pressure the filmmakers to actually look elsewhere for their funding. So it's a difficult one. If you're a Sikh and a Sikh who follows the religion religiously, if you excuse the pun, then absolutely, I think it is your very right and almost your obligation to boycott these sorts of films and to pressure the filmmakers. From somebody looking from the outside in, I think, yeah, that is the way to do it. It's got to come from the community. I'm loath to push regulations, but ultimately, if that is what is necessary, and we know that alcohol does harm health, there's absolutely no ambiguity there. It is the cause of a dreadful amount of bad statistics on the health side, certainly in the West. It's provable. So there's no argument there. So there is an argument for regulation. I don't know. I'll leave it up to Khalistan to make its own decision on Khalistan. Maybe Khalistan will regulate against it. We will see. But yeah, James, it's an ongoing battle, and I think the community are right to back the pressure against the filmmakers for this. Alcohol is an evil thing. It is not a great thing. In moderation, it serves a purpose here in the West, but certainly it's a very fine line until it starts harming health, and even small amounts are seen to harm health. The drugs, likewise, I've seen, and just to quickly move into the drug side, it's not just marijuana, it's actually just day-to-day pharmaceuticals that have now been embedded in Western cinema. Even I've noticed this in Western cinema, how you just need to watch an American sitcom to see how embedded and almost normal it is to see just normal drugs, whether it's antidepressants or whether it's just these drugs just to sort of make you feel a little bit happier and help your day go through a little bit more easy. These are just becoming almost normal. They are stressing the normality of taking these dreadful pharmaceuticals. And again, it's because they are funding the budgets of a lot of these sitcoms and films. It's an evil. It's an insidious evil that has infiltrated our cinema and our media, and I really think it is good to push back on these things, James. So yeah, it's a very hot topic, I would say, this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, here in Canada, the regulations are quite strict, and they're actually introducing now on every single cigarette, like not just the package, but every single cigarette, they're printing health warnings on them. And, I don't see the same happening on liquor bottles. We don't see warnings on liquor bottles that say, been making stupid people even dumber for, over 150 years.
Alcohol is a drug.
It's a matter of, we've got freedom of, sorry?
I said alcohol is a drug. I mean, there's no ambiguity about it. It is a drug, and it's only through cultural differences that it hasn't been banned in the West.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really one that, you got to have freedom of choice, but at what point do you draw the line on the marketing and influence on that end? I mean, we saw where the marketing and the impact of corporate America had on the opioid crisis around the globe. So again, it, starts one way, but just transitions, or people don't realize the harm that's coming with it and at what cost to our society and our families. So we'll have to keep an eye on it and see if it continues to increase or if society finally draws a line there. But as we look at what impacts the world, Angus, the COP29 summit is done. This is the 29th International Climate Summit that brought world leaders and delegates together. They were looking at increasing the budget for climate change and to hit the 1.5 degree challenge at just over $1 trillion going into it. That's what they were hoping to achieve in terms of the negotiations and the budgets, but they came in far short of that. It ended up being simply $300 billion that they agreed to. And this actually almost caused this year's summit to collapse. It went about 33 hours in terms of the length of the negotiations. And a lot of developing countries were quite upset because they didn't feel that enough was being contributed by the Western nations and the G20 nations to contribute to an issue that they see is really imbalanced. They feel that a lot of developing countries are not contributing to the levels of climate impact in which the Western and industrialized nations are having. And this makes sense because we have a lot more of the pollution from industry, from automobiles, where in a lot of developed countries they may not have as many or be able to afford it. And then you have to look at other areas such as fuel being used for whether it is cooking or heating homes. In some nations such as India, this is a major issue, and people are literally choking on the smog, and it's toxic. They have closed some schools and other businesses throughout the country because of the toxic levels of smog that are just unseen in the past. They're, instead of going down, going up. And the toxic particulates that are in the air are causing cancer, among other issues. Now, ironically, as we see Narendra Modi and his friends in India getting caught up in a $265 million corruption and bribery scandal, they have the nerve to come back to the climate summit saying that the amount that's being committed is just a paltry sum. They are saying that they need more money to combat the climate crisis in India, and yet they are also at the same time bragging about being an international power when it comes to their economy, that they are one of the fastest growing economies in the world, that they are looking to have a seat at the international tables because they want to be recognized as a developed nation. And at the same time, they continue to look at the West to prop up, whether it's agriculture or in this case, the climate change debate, and ways to fix it. And that is a very big slap in the face, I think, by Narendra Modi, that they can have such levels of corruption and bribery and other things going on in their nation while they criticize other countries for not giving them enough to deal with the climate issue that they committed to fixing over 20 years ago. And even as recently as 2019, they had committed to reduction of the greenhouse gases and the smog levels by 30%, and they have instead not even come close to that level. Now, with a population of 1.3 billion people, of course, they are going to have a lot more pollutants in the air and emissions being created, but at the same time, that also gives them the opportunity to be one of the highest in terms of the reduction of the per capita tonnage of the particulates and the pollution levels. Now, over the next several years, they want to increase the spending on climate change, which, of course, is an essential issue. This is not in debate. We're not challenging that. But basically, what you're looking at is since the start of the Ukraine war, the Western nations have contributed over $380 billion to the Ukraine war, while we are not making the same level of commitments to our climate change problems and the future of our planet for future generations. Now, looking at India and China as being the responsible parties for over 55% of the world's pollution, let's take a look at a couple of ways that it is being contributed to and what's causing this. Looking at 2021, air pollution in India caused an estimated 2.1 million deaths that were related directly to the air pollution. That's not including the pollutants that are being thrown into the rivers and their waterways. And so, of course, thermal power plants, vehicle pollution, industrial emissions, wood and dirty fuel sources for heating and cooking, which I've already covered. And now let's take a look at the levels of medical and death-related impacts. So almost 40% of heart disease-related deaths, 33% of lung cancer deaths, 20% of type 2 diabetes related deaths, 21% of stroke deaths, and 70% of COPD deaths. Now, this is looking at deaths. This is not even counting in the impact on the daily lives and the cost to medical systems and treatments for those who don't die as a direct result of it, but that suffer illnesses, whether that's asthma, whether that's tumors that go treated as opposed to the deaths. I mean, it's just an insane amount, Angus, of particulates and contribution to the global climate issue, and yet they turn around and criticize for the West for not giving them enough money to deal with what is a homegrown issue. Now, as I close out this report, I'm going to play a quick video that is just an announcement or a small video about climate change that came from the COP29 Humanitarian and Climate Summit, and we'll play that for you. And then as we finish up, I want you to think back to the first story, and this was a challenge I had planned. Try to think of how many or what brands of alcohol that were visualized in that story on the screen, because now you probably don't even realize that it's in your subconscious, but you may not be able to name those brands. So that was just a little challenge to throw you off with today's show. But let's take a look at the video here.
In the last 20 years, the humanitarian appeals associated with climate crises has gone up 800%. So it's been a vast increase in the humanitarian requirements because of the additional climate shocks that we've seen. And any rise, a half-degree rise in the global warming temperatures means that 5 million additional people may be displaced as a result. And what we see is that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. It affects women and girls disproportionately. A recent FAO study found that a 1 degree rise in global temperature means a 34% drop in female-headed household income. So it's a significant economic impact as well on women and the women-led households. One of the main things that we've talked about here is the importance of looking at climate and the overlay of conflict and fragile settings, because what we see is that climate financing, in some cases development financing, goes to where it's most easily absorbed rather than where it's most needed. And what we need to do is reach the people who are furthest left behind and address their needs. So to address the humanitarian needs that have increased as a result of climate change and the climate crises, the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is the Secretary General's global response fund, it has given $2.5 billion since inception to climate-related or extreme weather events. That's almost a quarter of the total funding that CERF has given. And over the past 2 years, each of the past 2 years, it's risen to about a third of the Central Emergency Response Fund's total allocation. And what we need to do now is find innovative financing applications to ensure that we are looking differently, that we crowd in climate finance. One of the ways that we're also trying to address this through innovation is through anticipatory action, which we have been looking at over the last 5 years. That means acting early, ahead of when the climate shocks are at their maximum. I think what COP29 can deliver in a non-technical way is really an understanding among climate negotiators that humanitarians have a very important role to play, and that we need to speak the same language. What I've also seen is that the climate adaptation and the language that they've used has not often been used by humanitarians, but it's exactly the activities that we work on with humanitarian funding. So I think it's really an understanding that we need to work together. Climate financing needs to address the needs of those that are currently furthest left behind. What we find is that climate is on top of already vulnerable people that are suffering from the conflict and fragile settings. So in those places where you have conflict and then you have a climate shock right on top, the ability for people to withstand those types of shocks is just so diminished. And so we really need to ensure that the funding goes where it's needed most and not where it's most easily absorbed.
Many levels that I don't know that we're going to hit that target by 2035 of $1.6 trillion to be spent on the issues, especially when you take into account, as I stated earlier, the $265 million bribery scandal in places like India, where it ironically is in relation to clean energy. The Adani Group had paid out these bribes to politicians and government representatives in order to get their panels and their solar projects off the ground in those states, protecting them and bringing them profits, and yet shutting out companies that were able to bring in the same technologies at a lower cost. So again, it's about the waste also being addressed, Angus.
Yes, this whole energy discussion and pollution discussion is weaving through the whole thing is a lot of politics and a lot of agendas, and there are a lot of different agendas and a lot of conflicting agendas throughout this whole thing. And ultimately, what matters is the health of the planet. But of course, when politics gets involved, then of course that whole issue gets a little bit, or enters a lot of, should we say, grey areas. Now, one of the interesting things that I notice with a lot of these arguments, I mean, ultimately, the simple facts are, to grow an economy, you need energy. Economies are built on energy, and that energy has to come from somewhere. And of course, the Western economies were built on energy. They were built on coal and oil and the old fossil fuels, and of course, those created a lot of pollution.
That's right.
Now, in the modern era, China and India, two of the most populous countries, and of course some of the largest economies, or certainly the fastest growing economies globally over the last 20, 30 years, they've had to build their economies on energy. And much of that, if not most of that, has been built on simple, good old-fashioned fossil fuels. So it's unsurprising that both India and China have suffered these dreadful smogs, these dreadful polluting blankets of smog that are literally killing their citizens. I myself have experienced it. I worked in Beijing and Shanghai only a few years ago, and I remember sitting on top of a tower block in an open air bar, and you literally couldn't see the building next to you because of the smog. And when I came back to Europe, I remember spending the next 3 or 4 weeks coughing because I was just trying to clear the muck from my lungs. It was absolutely appalling. But this is how they have built their economies. They've built it on good old-fashioned dirty fossil fuels. And in fact, here on Satellite, we reported, remember, a year ago, we talked about, again, these annual smogs, these dreadful smogs, and the statistics of how many people were dying were absolutely horrifying. And the Indian government have tried to take measures against it, but ultimately people are still dying, and here we are again a year later. Now, this whole COP29, and I did read about how nations like India are standing up and saying, this is disgusting that the Western nations, all you can offer is a paltry, in their words, they use this word paltry, $300 billion. How dare the West, in all its hypocrisy, only offer to pay us $300 billion? Well, here are some of the actual hard facts of reality. The UK has, according to the experts, in its entire history, the United Kingdom, through the Industrial Revolution and all the pollutants that these countries say that we built our huge economy on, we are, I think, now the 6th largest economy in the world. We dropped from 5th place now to 6th. But if you accumulate all the pollution that the British Empire ever created, ever since the British Empire existed through to the present day, I think we are currently sitting in 4th position in that table of global polluters. Now, just behind us is India. Now, they are relatively new in this table, and it's only taken maybe a couple of decades to accumulate what the British Empire accumulated in 300 years. India has accumulated in literally a matter of a few years, and literally like less than 20 years. And in very short order, literally I think in a matter of months, India will overtake the UK in terms of its accumulated pollution in the world. So what that means is that within a few years, India is going to shoot up to the top of the table alongside China. And yet we are in this weird position of the UK having to contribute billions of pounds of our taxpayers' money to India to make up for our pollution, when in fact India is by far the greater polluter in the world. So we're the ones funding India to pay reparations for the pollution that we did, and yet now India are the one who's actually polluting the world. In fact, it's India who should now be paying us this money to apologise for its own pollution. And India continues this trajectory. India continues to burn fossil fuels. India is killing its own citizens. It is polluting the world because it is growing its massive economy through dirty fossil fuels. And there's no sign, or very few signs, that it's changing tack on this. China, at least, now has the largest renewables energy program in the world. But despite the fact they're still building a coal-fired power station every month, but China have got the right tactics. They know that they need to change to renewables in time, but they're being sensible about it. They're saying, look, we will do that transition in time, but it will happen. It might take a few decades, but we will get there. They're not destroying their own economy in the process through a managed transition. Here in the West, certainly in the UK, we're not doing a managed transition. We just set an arbitrary 2030. We will reduce our pollution by an enormous amount, in fact, an unachievable amount. And in that process, we are bankrupting our own economy to try and meet these ridiculous targets, these unachievable artificial targets. But in the middle, India are just forging ahead. They're growing the economy, and Modi's government are just saying, to hell with it. Yeah, we're doing a few token solar powered farms, but ultimately they're building the economy and they're killing their citizens and they are polluting the world with it, James. And I think it is appalling that, of course, they are promoting their billionaire mates who are likewise bribing their polluting ways in return, just to ensure that they continue to build their industrial empires, and they're killing Indian citizens in the process, James.
Yeah, and the numbers that are dying are just astronomical, Angus. It's hard to fathom that not being, lumped into the criminality of governments by allowing it at the same level as you would see like the genocides and such as well, because at the end of the day, they are killing their own citizens, but allowing it to continue by not taking responsibility. And I also think to end that off, Angus, I think we also need to recognize that with the mass changes that are going on in China, they are financing their changes. They are not like India coming to the table and screaming that the West is not giving them enough money to deal with it. They are taking the bull by the horns and actually leading their own initiatives to help with the climate crisis, Angus.
Yeah, pretty appalling. It's deeply hypocritical, unfortunately, of India to stand out. And I was quite offended when they say these sums are paltry, when in fact it's India actually. Give it a few years, they are the ones who are going to be one of the greatest polluters on the planet, and yet we are funding them to say sorry for our pollution. So anyway. Let us move on, James. And I'm going to quickly start my set of stories with something that happened in the British Parliament just a few days ago. We talk a lot about Jagtar Singh Johal, and we always like to raise the plight of Jaggi, who remains in prison 7 years down the line. The British government have been pressured ever since the day he was imprisoned and tortured, provably tortured. The British government since then have been shameful in their inaction, and we have highlighted it amongst many people, including, of course, his brother, who's been fighting hard every single day of his life since the day his brother was in prison to try and highlight the plight of Jagtar Singh Johal, who remains in prison 7 years, still without conviction. He has had over 130 appearances in court, and basically his case has been dragged out by the Indian government because they're trying to set an example to anybody who dares highlight the disgusting historic stain of the genocide of 1984 and, of course, the years that followed throughout the 1980s and 1990s, where hundreds of thousands of young Sikh men were murdered in cold blood through extrajudicial killings. That is what Jagtar Singh Johal was trying to highlight, and he's now in prison, languishing in prison. Again, without conviction. There is no normal rule of law being applied to him, and the British government have done absolutely nothing to free him. Now, all that aside, I'm pleased to report that in the British Parliament just a few days ago, Jaggi's own MP, Member of Parliament for his constituency, asked the Prime Minister recently the following question.
Final question, Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to note that the Prime Minister had good discussions with Prime Minister Modi and deepened our bilateral ties and our unique bonds. Can the Prime Minister assure me that my constituent, Jagtar Singh Johal's 7-year arbitrary detention was raised with Modi during those discussions to help bring him home to Dumbarton?
Hear, hear.
I thank him for raising that, and let me give him that reassurance that it was raised. It's an extremely important case, so it was raised by me. It has been raised by other ministers, as he would expect.
Great. I mean, it was raised. There was no mention of the words. He will never repeat those words, arbitrary detention, those significant words, which he was very quick to utter pre-election when he was campaigning and trying to get the Sikh vote. But he's never mentioned those same words ever since he's become elected as Prime Minister. He will not say the words arbitrary detention. And here, yeah, I mean, we can remain optimistic. It was raised. I think it would be understandable that he wouldn't give too much away because presumably those discussions remain behind closed doors and he doesn't want to upset the apple cart, as they say. But ultimately, I still remain cynical, and let's just say I think his words there didn't fill me with confidence that he went into those discussions at the G20 with Narendra Modi with any form of robust language. I don't think he went in there really with his back straight, and I don't think he got off his knees to sort of say to Modi, look, here's how it's going to happen. You follow the rule of law and the rules of democracy. I think he probably went in there, might have just mentioned it as an aside, and then said, right, now let's talk about trade deals. So, James, I remain deeply cynical, as I'm sure most people do.
Absolutely, Angus. And it's also interesting to note that at no point did he say that the talks were ongoing, to at least acknowledge that publicly, or that they've actually made any progress, even if it was incremental or tiny. He did not make any mention of any progress at all.
Absolutely. So we will see. And as I say, the jury is out. We will judge by results, but as I keep saying, I remain deeply cynical. I don't feel the language is robust enough or forceful enough to give any confidence to any of us, certainly any observers, that they are actually going to do anything about it. But we will see. We will see. Now, I'm going to move on to another story now, and this is, again, this is really holding the British government to account. And the Sikh Federation here in the UK have been actually one of the forefront. They've been in the vanguard of lobbying the British government, and certainly the 11 British Sikh MPs, members of Parliament, that we now have in this new British government. They've been lobbying very, very hard, of course, many issues, including Jagtar Singh Johal, of course, about the whole transnational repression issue, the issue of the potential murder of Avtar Singh Kandar, and of course the issue of the genocide, officially recognising the 1984 genocide of November 1984, and of course this promised inquiry about British involvement in the dreadful attack on the Darbar Sahib in 1984, the Golden Temple, and what assistance the British government and British armed forces lent to the Indian government at the time, Indira Gandhi's government. What consultation and what advice and assistance did the British government give to Indira Gandhi on that dreadful attack? We were promised an investigation, an official investigation by this current government, and again they remain silent. But the Sikh Federation has remained forthright and strong and robust in their lobbying, and they continue to lobby. Now, I'm interested to see actually in one of our more right-wing papers, the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail stands on the right wing. They've always been stood in opposition, certainly on the media side. They stand in opposition to the current Labour government, and they are the mouthpiece of the Conservative side of the political spectrum. And unsurprisingly, they are really looking at the cracks in the Labour government, and they're really trying to exploit those cracks and to highlight actually the failures of Starmer's government. And just a couple of days ago, Andrew Pearce, who's again a Conservative-based journalist, he's always one of the first to highlight the failures of the Labour government. And in the Daily Mail just a couple of days ago, he highlighted certainly this failure. There's been many failures of the current government, which I won't go into, but certainly for the Sikh community, there's been a lot of failures. And in fact, the British government even managed to upset the Hindu community as well. Now, Rishi Sunak, a practicing Hindu, our former Prime Minister, he, of course, did an awful lot for the British Hindu population, didn't do anything for the British Sikh population, as we often raised. But at least he managed to appease the British Hindu population. Not so Keir Starmer. And the Daily Mail, Andrew Pearce in the Daily Mail made the following little article. He said, days after apologising for serving meat and alcohol at a Diwali reception, yes, Keir Starmer managed to hold a reception to celebrate Diwali for the Hindus, but he actually at the reception served meat and alcohol. I mean, a massive cultural faux pas, a massive cultural mistake to serve meat and alcohol to his Hindu guests. Oops. The government's social media accounts failed to acknowledge Gurpurab, a Sikh festival celebrating the birth of the founder Guru Nanak Ji. More than 300 Sikh groups sent a letter to Starmer over his indefensible blunder, while the social media accounts of world leaders and organisations, including the Labour Party itself, marked the occasion. But from Downing Street, there was a deafening silence. So Andrew Pearce actually pointed out the fact that, look, I mean, not only have you upset the Hindu community, but this absolute blatant deafening silence for the Sikh community is actually a deep insult, particularly after all his lobbying up to the election to win the Sikh vote. As soon as in power, he's absolutely completely forgotten about his Sikh backers. And of course, it was the Sikh Federation who've been very active in highlighting all these failures, but of course lobbying Starmer to represent the Sikh community. And Dabinderjit Singh, who's again one of the principal advisors to the Sikh Federation, has been very vocal and very active in his lobbying about this. And it starts to get a little bit more serious than just simple, I would say, political posturing. It's got into British intelligence, and in fact the activities of the West Midlands Police and British intelligence, and how they've acted on behalf or not on behalf of the British Sikh community. And in an article, it was also, and Andrew Pearce did continue, that it was noted it wasn't the first time that the Sikh Federation itself felt that the government was dismissive of its concerns, pointing out that they had been forced to embarrassingly alert Craig Guilford, Chief Constable of West Midlands Police, about threat to life warnings for Sikhs in the area from British intelligence, of which he was reportedly totally unaware. Now, what's this about? Now, the West Midlands Police are the prevailing police force over the Midlands, here in the centre of the UK, which has a very, very large Sikh population. And there's a lot of friction between the local Sikh population and the West Midlands Police, based on many, many years of intimidation and harassment by West Midlands Police of the local Sikh community. And this dates back to many, many years ago, and in fact even back to 1984. Believe it or not, the West Midlands police chief at that time was actually visited the Punjab just before June 1984. So again, the weird sort of strange links, and there have been many reports of collaboration between West Midlands Police and their counterparts in India, which in turn have led to various raids in recent years of Sikh and particularly Khalistan activists. Their homes were raided by West Midlands Police, and it has become evident that this was due to first of all collaboration between West Midlands Police and India. And also, when Jaggi himself was imprisoned in India 7 years ago, there is evidence that MI6 itself, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, provided intelligence to India that led to the arrest of Jagtar. So again, this is all in the context of this. And it turns out that the current new Chief Constable of West Midlands Police didn't even know that our intelligence services had served these threat to life warnings to members of the Sikh community here in the UK. These threat to life notices are basically where the intelligence services are warning individuals, saying, look, we are aware in our intelligence circles that there are people out there trying to kill you, that there is a genuine present danger to your life, probably from India. And ironically, they're not allowed to say where from, but of course it is obviously from India. But the current chief of police wasn't aware of these threats to life, that even his own people in his own area had been issued these threats. He wasn't aware of this. So again, it's either incompetence or it's deliberate, it's a deliberate agenda, again, just to really cause problems for our British Sikh community. Now, Dabinjit said there were tens of thousands of constituents who will find it impossible to defend this oversight as Prime Minister to Keir Starmer by not putting out a message on Gurpurb and reassuring the Sikh community about their safety and security. So again, it's this whole context of this look, it's either incompetence of being unaware, or there is a deliberate agenda that now that you're in power, Mr. Starmer, that you're just ignoring those very people, that very community who provided an enormous amount of votes, potentially up to 1 million votes for the Labour Party, but now he's turning his back on them. The Sikh Federation called out former leaders Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak for the same oversight when they first came into office. Of course, they were equally as guilty, and in both instances they apologised, and Mr Singh noted the same mistake was not repeated and it was put right the following year. And it was said at the time, a public apology for forgetting the Gurpurb of Guru Nanak Dev Ji and a promise that the same mistake will not be repeated will simply be not good enough. That's quite ominous words, saying that it's all very well, you can apologise now, but that's just not enough. We need to see more action. And he added, this can only be described as another blunder that could easily have been avoided. Now, a spokesperson for the Labour Party said that acknowledged the oversight and said the Labour Party was pleased to send its best wishes to the Sikh community on the occasion of Guru Nanak Dev Ji's birth anniversary this week through its multiple social media accounts. And they are proud to have 11 Sikh MPs following this year's election. The British Sikh community is an important contributor to fixing the foundations of our country and delivering change. Together we will rebuild Britain. Yeah, I mean, it is, we know the community is an important contributor to fixing the foundations of our country. But Labour Party, they are also an important contributor to the fact that you're in power because of the number of votes. So I think it's about time that you actually recompensed and actually gave thanks for those votes by actually acting on the issues upon which you were actually elected. So, and then likewise, the Sikh Federation UK have actually publicly on their social media have highlighted the very fact. And they wrote to Downing Street on behalf of 300 British Gurdwaras and various Sikh organisations, and the gaffe, as they call it, this mistake of forgetting to put out a Gurpurb message, which was totally avoidable given the fact that their correspondence with a Labour MP on the 23rd of September, well in advance, warning of Gurpurb and asking for it to be recognised. So there's no excuse for it. Hopefully a lesson's been learnt, although they are still waiting for it to be acknowledged and put right. And this was, and then they referred to this article in the Daily Mail, Andrew Pearce's article. However, it is far, and they acknowledge the fact that it at least has been acknowledged in the mainstream media. However, what is far more serious is the deadly silence still from the Prime Minister, from Downing Street, from our Foreign Secretary David Lammy, again, who refused to repeat the very words that he himself uttered: arbitrary detention of Jaggi. So David Lammy remains completely silent on all the issue. Yvette Cooper and Dan Jarvis, MBE, about the cover-up of specific threat to life warnings by British intelligence services to Sikhs and the safety and security of British Sikh activists. And they wrote to Keir Starmer about this on the 21st of November. Again, still a deafening silence. We have provided further specific details in our latest letter, and they say watch this space. So, of course, we will let you know if there is any response. And I am delighted to say that this very evening in London, the British Houses of Parliament will actually be hosting a celebration for the Gurpurb of the birth date of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. This will be held this evening in the Houses of Parliament. The Sikh Federation UK and many members of the community will be there represented, as of course I believe many of our Sikh MPs will be there representing it as well. And I'm delighted to say I have been very kindly invited myself to this very event. So I will report back in due course. And just on that note, just to say there will not be, unfortunately, a Perspective show tomorrow, because unfortunately I will be attending this and be involved in this whole event. So unfortunately there will be no show tomorrow, but we'll be back as normal the following day with Perspectives. So there you go, James. A lot of goings on, and unfortunately our government, unlike the Trudeau government, who has been absolutely magnificent, I have to say, in terms of representing the Canadian Sikh community, unfortunately our British government has been shameful in its own representation of the very people, the very community that helped put it in power.
Absolutely, Angus. And I mean, the politicians spend so much time in front of the cameras. What does it take to offer a sincere apology, while you have the cameras there? I mean, it really doesn't take much to make an apology and acknowledge that mistakes were made and to move on, because it really, when you do that, it brings the community together. It raises the level of respect for the individual, whether it's politician or staff. Just raises that level of respect for acknowledging and accepting that a mistake was made, and to try and correct it and at least apologize for it.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the British Sikh MPs, the 11 Sikh MPs, must be squirming in discomfort, because it is their very own leader that they must feel a little bit embarrassed about. And in fact, Keir Starmer is in a whole host of trouble here. Just by way of example, he's managed to upset just about every community, whether it's farmers or whether it's our pensioners. In only 3 or 4 months of being in power, his policies have just really upset just about every section of British society. And in fact, there is now a petition that's been launched only 2 days ago to call for a general election. And this petition, which in practical terms is going to be meaningless, but it is the message it's sending out. This petition in 2 days has achieved over 2.5 million signatures of the British public demanding that there is a general election, essentially to remove Keir Starmer. So this is only 4 months after the general election. So I think in that itself speaks massive volumes. But anyway, enough of politics. Let us move on now to my second story, or third story, whichever. And this is quite a serious and quite a big story. It's only just emerged, and it's relatively subdued across the media, but it points to a much bigger issue. This is the story in the United States just a few days ago, that an Indian gentleman was indicted by a grand jury in the US for trying to export banned materials to Russia. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, we often talk about India's historic ties with Russia, And of course, with the Ukraine war going on, this has highlighted this rather uncomfortable relationship for the West, certainly, who are trying to seduce India as an ally to form an alliance to buttress the growing threat of China. Unfortunately, India has this historic tie, this very embedded tie with Russia, with the communist regime of Russia and Vladimir Putin. And of course, we do often know, and we do often report the fact that India is funding effectively the Ukraine war. They are funding Putin's war machine, certainly with dollars, and as we reported yesterday with James's story, even with people feeding that great meat grinder war machine. Well, it turns out that also Russia, to continue its war against Ukraine, it needs hardware, it needs material to feed its arms industry to be able to continue the fight. And of course, the West and the rest of the world have enforced sanctions. They're saying, no, you must not be allowed to export hardware that can be used for military purposes. Now, it turns out that an Indian man, Sanjay Kaushik, age 57 of India, has been caught in the United States trying to export controlled aviation components with dual civilian and military applications to end users in Russia. He's charged with attempting to illegally export a navigation and flight control system from Oregon to Russia through India, and with making false statements in connection with an export. Now, according to court documents, this dates back to September. Kaushik is alleged to have conspired with others to unlawfully obtain aerospace goods and technology from the US for entities in Russia. The goods were purchased under the false pretenses that they would be supplied to Kaushik and his Indian company, when in fact they were destined for Russian end users. Kaushik and his co-conspirators purchased an attitude and heading reference system, which is a device that provides navigation and flight control data for aircraft from an Oregon-based supplier. Components such as the AHARs require a license from the Department of Commerce to be exported to certain countries, including Russia. Now, it needs a license. This license was falsely claimed that, and it was obtained falsely by claiming that India was the end user, and of course it was destined, in fact, to be shipped subsequently to Russia. He was arrested in Miami in October the 17th, pursuant to a criminal complaint. He was arrested and he's been in court. Now, if convicted, he faced penalties of 20 years in prison and a fine of not more than $1 million for each indictment, etc., etc. Now, okay, this gentleman's been caught, but in fact, this actually is a bigger story, because essentially what he was actually arrested for, this component, and I know this from indeed my own expertise in terms of navigation systems. An AHAR system is essentially, it's an attitude sensor which can be used in aircraft, but it can also be used for missiles. Missiles use navigation systems, satellite navigation systems, and also to correct their trajectory, they need motion sensors which are able to assess their motion in 3 dimensions. And an AHAR sensor helps it to do this. And very, very high quality, high-end AHAR sensors are needed to guide missiles to their targets. Now, of course, it's very easy. They have double uses, as it's called. They can be used in civilian uses, in aircraft, but likewise they can be used in missiles. So what we have here is that these components are being manufactured and purchased in the United States, and they are being shipped through India to Russian end users. In other words, probably for missile usages. So India essentially is exporting banned technology from the United States to Russia to be used for Russian military uses. That is the big story here. Once again, it is highlighting the fact that when we see Narendra Modi physically embracing Vladimir Putin, that isn't just for show. There is clearly a deeper relationship going on here. India is facilitating the Russian war. India is facilitating the growth and continuance of the Russian war machine. There is absolutely no ambiguity here. This is what it's all about, James. Unfortunately, India will never be an ally of the West. India is much more closely embedded with Russia. That has always been the case since 1947. Keep watching our podcast if you want to know why the KGB had such an involvement in Russia. This week's podcast coming out, you absolutely must watch, because you will see the evidence of why and how the KGB are so deeply embedded with the Indian government, Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi, how she in turn was indoctrinated by the KGB. That is the foundation of why India still remains deeply involved with Moscow, with Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. That is a relationship that will never be broken. I hate to say this to the West, that relationship is too deep. It will never be broken, despite everything, despite all our overtures to India to bring it on side. So, all that aside, James, there you go. I find this story, although it's a little snapshot, it's just one gentleman who's been arrested. It opens up, it breaks open, it lifts the lid, it lifts up those layers of a much bigger story and a much more scary story.
Absolutely. And with the sanctions, I mean, they don't specify that you can only export if it's for civilian use. It is just plain and simple. You cannot export these parts to be transitioned, whether it's through India or directly to Russia. You just can't do it. It's against the sanctions for civilian or military use at the end of the day. But it should also give pause to the announcements by India and the US that they are working on increased levels of trade for technology, for military, for weapons. I mean, this is really a big concern when India is feeding all of this basically empowerment to Russia to continue this illegal war.
And again, and I always come back to the story of Khalistan. I mean, Khalistan is needed more than ever, because I am absolutely convinced that the overwhelming majority of the average Hindu an average Indian person in the street has absolutely no idea how in bed their nation is with Russia and the totalitarian regime there. And it is no surprise that Narendra Modi has taken them down that totalitarian route in lockstep with Russia. That is where India is heading. That is why Khalistan is needed, to offer an alternative to those who prefer the rule of law, to those who prefer the rule of democracy. Because as I say, I think the average Indian remains in complete ignorance that even their very constitution is based around the philosophy of communism. That's where it's been and that's where it's going. So anyway, James, on that note, let us move on, because we're rapidly, in fact, we've run out of time, so we really need to move the show forward. Let's rush into our comments section. Loads of wonderful comments. Thank you for those, as always. So Freddie Mercury, one of our regulars, says, hi Angus, would it be possible for Satellite to create a separate channel for English speakers? Well, actually, funnily enough, we did have a separate YouTube channel that was for English speakers only. Now, this must have been maybe about a year ago, and it was for strategic reasons that we actually decided to merge the English-speaking channel with the Punjabi-speaking channel. Essentially, it was because I think the growth of the English-speaking channel was quite slow, because obviously it's a much smaller audience than the Punjabi-speaking. So it was felt maybe it would help the growth of the English side if it was merged with the Punjabi side. So actually, yes, we did have our own English-speaking side, and but we're now embedded in just the one single channel. Should we go back to it? I don't know. It's very hard to say. The fact that we're demonetized now actually does actually maybe make another argument that maybe we should restart the English side again, because what have we got to lose? Certainly there's nothing financial, right. But certainly in terms of subscribers and getting that message out and getting the numbers up, we are still probably better staying within one channel again, because now that we're over 20,000 subscribers, that growth, the growth of a YouTube channel is always exponential. It gets faster and faster the more subscribers you get. And as we hopefully grow to 200,000 and 2 million, as one of our correspondents, Amritpal Singh, said, that is our goal. I think we're probably better sticking where we are now and just enjoying that trajectory, that exponential trajectory. But a nice suggestion, thank you for that. Hap B says, Modi used to hold BJP meetings at Adani's home. Full-on Gujarat gang conning the world. Yeah, I mean, it is this Gujarat mafia. And don't forget, of course, Lawrence Bishnoi himself, a Gujarati. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is, James, this whole sort of, this cosy Gujarati sort of mafia who are scratching each other's backs and taking care of each other's interests. I think many commenters have talked about the commercial benefits, let's say, of being a Gujarati. They all stick together, don't they, James?
Absolutely, and that's something that we discuss on the show regularly and see that. So again, it is, it's just a matter of, will this finally be the collapse of Modi and his political influence?
Indeed. Now, our muscular contributor from Germany, the Jim Germany, points to the fact that the Brahmins are the root cause of all problems against humanity in India. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I couldn't say it any better. If you follow the issues, the caste system and all the problems, the human rights abuses, everything in India, it all funnels back up to that one root cause. And I think it is the Brahmins of India who were handed power essentially by the British establishment, by the British Empire. They were gifted the control of India, and it is from that gift of control that they have continued that control, and unfortunately they maintain that control through simple brute force, through the caste system and the simple oppression of minorities across that nation. So yes, absolutely, I couldn't say it any better. Which then leads on to lots of quite interesting comments. And there is one about the Brahmins, which I'll come on to. This is the final comment in our Critics Corner, James. Again, my favourite section. So I'm going to start off with Darius, who actually did make a very similar comment in yesterday's Critics Comment. But it was so good it had to come back twice. And Darius says, white Europeans massacring people all over the world and preaching human rights. What a hypocrite. Yes, absolutely. And as I said to your previous similar comment, absolutely right. It is deeply hypocritical for the West to stand up and demand and talk about human rights after our dreadful massacres that we perpetrated throughout our own empire's histories. You're absolutely right. However, you seem to forget that we have since evolved from those days, and we now have the rule of law, we have democracy, and we also spend most of our time, it appears, absolutely punishing ourselves. Yes, self-punishing for our own abuses throughout our history of our empires. But we're not the only ones. Every empire throughout history, whether it was Genghis Khan, whether it was the Romans, whether it was black Africans across West Africa, we've all had our shameful parts of our own history. But what we should be judged by now is how we ourselves look back at that and how we admonish ourselves for what we did, and we are doing our best to make things right, which is why we in Britain are campaigning for Khalistan, to make up for our own oppression against the Sikh community in India, as it was then in the Indian Empire. And that is why we now are campaigning powerfully for Khalistan, to say sorry for the sins of our forefathers, James.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are still mistakes being made today that need correcting, and whether that's world wars, or not world wars, but wars and conflicts around the world that we've fed into or that we've helped to support, I guess you could say, to some extent. So there's still a lot to be corrected there. And, you can look right through to the international criminal courts. There's a reason why the U.S. pulled back from actually being a signatory, because they don't want to be held accountable at a political level for some of the atrocities that have happened. But again, steps are being taken to correct that or to make changes, no matter what accountability factors are in place.
Indeed, and absolutely, I think the point is valid here. Is that when the West bomb Iraq or Afghanistan into rubble, yeah, I think that's absolutely appalling. It was unjustified, and many of us, millions of us, literally here in the West, took to the streets to campaign against it, to campaign against our own politicians who drove us into those sorts of wars. And absolutely, so we're not hypocrites. Our politicians are. So don't label us all with the same brush. That's what I would say to your comment. But thank you again for your critical comment. Now, Franzuel, who is also one of our regular critics, thank you, Franzuel, for your comment. Propaganda-funded channel. Absolutely we are, and we're proud of it. Getting caught red-handed for misinformation and lies? No. I'm sorry. We don't push out any misinformation or lies. Everything that we push out has been corroborated, and if we get it wrong, tell us where we've got it wrong. We are pointing out misinformation from India, and we show why it is in misinformation. We show the truth, and I'm fascinated to know what you think. Show us evidence of misinformation. Please tell us where we've been lying. Provide the evidence, provide links, anything. Don't just stand up there and say, oh, it's all misinformation. We don't say this about India, it's all misinformation. We explain why it's misinformation, and we show an alternative narrative with backed up evidence. Now, if you want to wade in and accuse us of the same, do the same. Show us the evidence. But thank you anyway for your comment. And finally, James, this is a goodie. Nativity. Ooh. You are targeting a group of people, the Brahmins. It can go against you as being racist propaganda, and you can be put in prison for the hatred that we spread. Be careful, I'm going to report you. James, we're going to be reported. Well, Nativity, I do talk a lot about the Brahmins. And you see, of course, it's not racism. It's actually calling out a political group who perpetuate a caste system that oppresses its people. It's calling out fascism, essentially. And thank you to Freddie Mercury, who actually came in and responded to this to say, report for what exactly? Calling out fascism? Yeah. So Nativity, by all means, please report us. I'd be fascinated to know who you'd report us to. The Brahmins? Maybe. Report us to the British government? Please do. Go ahead. You are very free. We live in a free world. And we are free to speak. We're not spreading hatred, we are spreading the truth, James, are we not?
Absolutely. And when it comes right down to it, we are talking about a political movement, about a political group. We are not talking about individuals, because no matter where you turn, you're going to have individuals within any group that are amazing people that actually are there because they have a certain belief, but they don't follow the same extremism as some. And they actually want to lead change from the inside. So again, I mean, to call it racism, you're entitled to your opinion, but I would strongly disagree with it.
Yeah, I mean, to be accused of racism, you'd have to be attacking a race. The Brahmins are not a race. They are a group, essentially a political group of people who regard themselves as superior to their fellow Indians. That's who we're targeting. That's not racism. That's standing up against fascism. So thank you, Nativity. Unfortunately, we must disagree with your point of view, but please, by all means, you have the right to report us. We look forward to the response. So, right, I had a fascinating, podcast last week. And we talked a lot about Khalistan. We actually talked about a lot of different issues affecting the Sikh community. This is Dr. Sandhu, and it was we actually covered a lot of ground. So do watch that, a fascinating discussion covering a lot of ground, not just Khalistan. But Sukhjinder Bajwa says the Khalistan referendum is a legal and peaceful process. Even India itself uses referendums in the past for the princely states of the Union of India. So Dr. Sandhu, as you rightly pointed out, referenda are a normal process of democracy. There's nothing wrong with a referendum, so why on earth are they afraid of holding one in the Punjab about Khalistan? Absolutely right. I think, there's no reason not to, unless you stand, like again, back to the Brahmins, unless you are a Brahmin and you fear what that might mean. And we know what it means. It basically means Khalistan will happen, and that in turn is likely to break up India. And then Naveen Aryaputri says, this is astonishing, very disappointing, more so with the global stage where India is taking a major role at this point. Now, this comes back to essentially the behaviour of India and its reputation, its failing reputation because of its current behaviour. Stability is vital. Now, this is an important point, James. This is quite a fascinating one. I didn't know this. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, visited India recently. And just after his visit, Bangladesh collapsed. Geo signed up with BlackRock. Any more disparate options and uprisings, Larry Fink will take over. India has the largest population under 30, so it has a huge future ahead. The West, on the other hand, has a growing population. There's a lot of big points in here. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to take each one of these turns. Firstly, BlackRock. Yeah, this massive hedge fund investment entity, whatever it happens to be. But essentially, they are worth trillions, I believe. I mean, wherever BlackRock goes, Yeah, an agenda follows, James. I think we could talk an awful lot about BlackRock, but essentially they control economies, literally. Their investments are so huge that their weight has the ability to literally change the direction of economies, and therefore they control too much power, frankly, in my opinion. And of course, you refer here to essentially an involvement in the Bangladeshi situation. And of course, the final point here, and I think this is very important, the demographics of India are very, very powerful. They have a huge population under 30, whereas here in the West, ours is skewed to the elder side of the demographics. We have an aging population, but it's India that is the future, James.
Absolutely, and I think that that's where Modi's underestimating the power of youth when it comes to technology, the understanding and the use of it, and how they are becoming more and more aware of the international perception of India.
Yeah, so there's a lot of important points we didn't have time to go into on that, but thank you for that comment. Yeah. That's a good comment. Now, Dr. Har Simran says, Dr. Bajit Singh is the speaker that makes the most sense on this platform. I wouldn't disagree. He is a very intelligent, very well-spoken gentleman, and he does speak an awful lot of sense. So do watch for that podcast. Yes, indeed, the team can learn from him, and indeed we do. That's why we get him on the podcast. So thank you. Now, he says, now he talks a lot about the Adani Group and he calls it the world's biggest cartel. It is absolutely in cahoots with the BJP and the RSS. I think you're right, pointing out that the Adani Group has essentially been pushing out this RSS agenda. It is the owner of major news networks in India. Of course, there's Godi Media that we often talk about that spreads this fake news, this pro-BJP agenda that it pushes out, and it works against Punjab and the Sikhs. Now, I didn't know this, that the Adani Group also recently opened an arms and ammunition factory in Kanpur. Yeah, slightly ominous what that could potentially mean, James. But we talked a lot about Adani. It's been working hand in hand, no doubt, with the Modi government.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, when you look at that, if in fact there's truth to them owning the arms and munitions factory, of course, are they shuttling stuff out the back door to Russia as well? I don't know that being a fact, but I'm just curious if that is the case, then, it's something to be concerned about.
Yeah, indeed. And again, I think will Adani be the thing that brings down Modi? That's going to be a fascinating story to follow. Right. Now, final comments. Parmjit Kaur says, people have the right to raise their voices. Sikhs are persecuted in the Punjab. Amritpal Singh is in prison for what? Very good question. What indeed is he in prison for? He, as we often say, is detained under very questionable legal grounds, and it's frankly a stain on India and the so-called rule of law in India. Now, this is interesting that Aman responds to this. Look, and obviously is either in the Punjab or has been there recently. It is literally hell in the Punjab. I know, I've seen enough in India. They're stuck. Glad I was out of the Punjab. I spent 24 years there. It's hard. It's not just the Punjab. It used to be the old Punjabi culture. Women used to be happy, sharing chores and beauty fixes. Fathers and men, like always, hardworking, brave, super loving of their daughters. There was no ego of climbing. You had closeness and spirituality. And basically talking about how wonderful the Punjab used to be. Now it's pollution, it's disrespect, it's rudeness. There is no general respect. In other words, society is breaking down. And then he can, I say it's a he, I don't know. But this person says, I hope Amritpal Singh is okay, as do we all. He's having a hard time, and his wife, Kirandeep, yeah, absolutely. In fact, that reminds me, let's get in touch with Kirandeep, who does quite often provide me with updates, actually, on Amritpal's situation. Kirandeep is so simple and beautiful, visits Amritpal in jail. She's had to relocate herself from the Punjab right across to the other side, to Assam, so at least she can be close to Amritpal. He's having so much hard time. Little children write him with get well letters. Free Singhs, free Punjab. Yeah, I mean, it just highlights this very dreadful story. We often talk about Jaggi detained in prison, essentially still awaiting any sort of conviction. Yeah. Likewise, Amritpal Singh, he is now an elected member of the Lok Sabha. He is an elected member of the Indian Parliament, and yet he still languishes in jail, still awaiting trial. I mean, I'm sorry, Narendra Modi, but what's happening? Why is this man, this elected member of your governance, why is he in jail? I see very little justification for it. I see actually very little international outcry about it when there damn well should be. And of course, ordinary people in India and across the Punjab, like you say here, little children are writing to him with get well letters. Because, he literally lives in fear. He actually demanded and went on hunger strike not that long ago to say, look, I need to be relocated from Chandigarh jail, Dibrugarh jail, Dibrugarh jail in Assam, back to Punjab because he literally feared for his life. That is how precarious his situation is in India. And again, it's a deep stain on India as a country that all these people, it's not just Amrit Pal and Jagtar Singh Johal who are in prison. There are many, many like these people who don't have such a high profile, who languish in jail in India. It is an absolute appalling outrage. It is nothing to do with the rule of law in India. These are political prisoners. Why isn't the West more vocal about this? They absolutely should be. It is actually shameful, in fact, on the West for not calling this out, James. I think the West should be much more vocal about pointing to these political prisoners and why do they still remain in jail.
Absolutely, but let's face it, Angus, we're having a hard enough time getting India to accept responsibility and culpability when it comes to their politicians being involved in crimes here in Canada, the US, the UK. So, of course, what are they going to listen to when it comes to politicians that are speaking about something within their own homeland? It's a tough one, but yes, I do think there has to be more outcry and more public awareness of this issue.
Indeed, and we ourselves from Satellite, we will continue our campaign to highlight and hold the Indian government to account for its so-called democratic credentials and its rule of law, and indeed to continue that campaign for what is only right, and that is the true new state of Khalistan. But that brings the show to a close once again for another day. Thank you so much for all your comments. Been loads and loads, and it's such a shame that we can't cover many, many more of them because, of course, many of them have been fascinating, containing loads of points that we would deeply love to discuss and loads of supporting comments. Thank you for those, and thank you, as always, for your critical comments. They always make us have a great laugh in Critics Corner, so do keep those coming as well. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and don't forget you can, of course, email us directly at message@satellogetv.com if there's something you'd like to bring to our attention, as indeed many of you have been doing so. Thank you for those. But in the meantime, it is end of another show. We will see you again back on Thursday. But until then, it is a goodbye from me, and it is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.